Let me begin first by thanking Janet and Joe Neubauer not only for their support of this study, but also their support of INSS, in particular the Neubauer Research Fellowship, which I happen to be a beneficiary of. Owen Alterman, who's my co-author on this project, he and I took the findings from this very comprehensive and very impressive survey that was done by Pew, and we said, so what does this mean for Israel and for pro-Israel activists in the United States? The problem as we see it is that the communal center of American Jewry is shrinking, and so with it the potential pool for pro-Israel activists is likewise shrinking. Now, by communal center, I'm referring specifically to Americans who, in the Pew survey, will identify as Jews by religion, but not Orthodox. And these have been critical for those, I mean, this is the mainstay of Jews who defend Israel in newspapers, in rallies, who lobby politicians who send donations. Now, there are two reasons why this communal center is shrinking. First and foremost, because of the overall number of Jews in the United States, as defined those who solely identify as Jews, is shrinking and is going to continue to shrink over the coming decades. It was previously discussed the growing levels of intermarriage, but there are other causes as well. One of them, and probably one of the key ones, is that the population is getting older, but the birth rate, the level of replacement is too low to be sustainable over the long term. There is a third issue, which is that there are also those who are leaving Judaism, and that number is substantial, I think, more than people tend to realize. There's a second issue, however, and that is that not only is the overall pie shrinking, but as a proportion of a shrinking pie, our communal center is also getting smaller. And it's being replaced on the one hand by growing numbers of Orthodox, and especially ultra-Orthodox, and on the other hand by a growing number, as was pointed out previously, of Jews not by religion. We've seen this, by the way, happen already. There was another survey done by led by Stephen Cohen of the New York area, where you saw the same sort of dynamic happen over only 20 years. So what do we do about this? Well, until today, the focus has been exclusively on shoring up this communal center. Let me give you an example of this. The Prime Minister's initiative, which again is a plan being formulated right now in the Ministry of Diaspora Relations, they're planning on investing $1.5 billion over the next 20 years, not shekels, dollars, in shoring up and bolstering Jewish identity, focusing particularly on 12 to 35-year-olds. Also, if you'd been to the Jewish Federation's General Assembly back in November, you would have seen that the proposals which were bandied about tended to focus again on this issue. Things like subsidies for Jewish preschool, better targeting and follow-up of birthright alumni, and creating new frameworks for volunteering in a Jewish framework. What we argue is that while these are all good ideas and should be pursued, it's time to be honest and admit that these are not going to solve the problem. So that from Israel's standpoint, and the standpoint of those who are involved in pro-Israel activism in the United States, it's time for us to look beyond this communal center. First, by looking at those of Jewish background, Jewish affinity, and second, for looking at the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. Now, you should note, we are not suggesting that we should stop trying, that we should stop these programs to shore up the communal center. Far from it. What we are suggesting is that we expand the focus, both in terms of our energy and our budgets, so that we look beyond just the communal center. We have to realize that there is in part a problem here of diminishing returns. In other words, because so much is spent today on shoring up this communal center, for each additional dollar we invest, the return is going to be increasingly limited. However, these two groups get almost no investment, no attention. And so as a result, investing in them could bring much more bang for the buck. Let's look a little closer about who we're talking about here, this Jewish background, Jewish affinity. The Pew survey, they defined the Jewish background as those who either were raised Jewish or had at least one Jewish parent, but today do not consider themselves to be Jews. The group who is Jewish Affinity is sort of a mirror image of the first. They weren't raised Jewish. They don't have a Jewish parent. And although, yes, they have a religion that's not Judaism, they feel some sort of connection. Many say because Jesus was Jewish, some because they're married to someone who's Jewish, some because they have a Jewish grandparent. What's the promise of this group? 3.6 million adults and another million children, which is almost on the same level as the total number of Jews in America who identify solely as Jews. There is a question, however, that even if there are large numbers, why do we think that these people would be pro-Israel per se? I mean, Jewish Affinity, that might make sense. But in particular, those of Jewish background, is it possible that someone who has left Judaism could be pro-Israel? Even if they are. How on earth are we going to find these people? It took 70,000 complete interviews to figure out who these people are, and a small portion of them. How are we going to ever find them? That is, if we're not going to use an app like Angry Birds, like the NSA might do. Well, it turns out that they are actually very pro-Israel. In fact, not only are, and I'll take out those of Jewish Affinity, it's what we call no-brainer, it's obvious. If we just look at Jewish background, what you see here is that they are actually not only more supportive than the average American, they're also much more supportive of Israel, politically supportive, not just attached to the land of Israel, which, by the way, they're also more attached to Israel, not necessarily the land of Israel, but more attached to Israel than are Jews, not by religion. But their support is political. And when you ask them, this is again coming from the Pew survey, if you ask them about United States support of Israel, they are more likely to say that the United States is not supportive enough, in fact, than the entire Jewish community as a whole. $972,000, excuse me. This is the number of individuals from Jewish backgrounds and affinity who donated to Jewish organizations in 2012 alone. Excuse me. This represents over a quarter of that population, which, again, as a percent, is larger than those Jews not by religion. Besides demonstrating a certain ripeness, that they are in fact ripe for pro-Israel activism, there's a fringe benefit here. Because they're donating to Jewish organizations, we have a way to figure out who our most likely potential activists are. Let me suggest another benefit, that they straddle the political divide. If we look here again at the numbers who are Democrat and Republican, the numbers for the Jewish background are about 51% versus 37%. And for Jewish Affinity, they're about split even, which I think defies a certain stereotype that we might have about this group, that they are evangelicals and Republican. This is critical because, as Owen and I have pointed out in previous research, the challenge, the political challenge for Israel in the future is likely to be on the Democratic side of the aisle. And so the partners we're going to need to look for have to have strong representation on the Democratic side of the aisle. Let's take a closer look now at the Haredim, or the UltraOrthodox. First of all, we have to realize they are by no means monolithic. There's an array of Lithuanian or yeshivish groups of Hasidim, various Hasidic sects. And they have a variety of beliefs, indeed worldviews, and capacity for pro-Israel activism. What's the promise here? First, it's not necessarily their large numbers today, it's the fact that they are growing so quickly. Again, that New York study from 2011, if you look at the number of adults who are ultra-Orthodox, today it's about 14%, but the number of children is just about 50% of the Jewish population in New York. Now, obviously, the situation in the rest of the United States is different than New York, but the trends are in the same direction, and it has to do again with fertility and birth rates. Let me suggest that again, that contrary to the stereotype that I think many of us have about the ultra-Orthodox and the Haredim in the United States, These people are actually quite supportive of Israel, not just attached to Israel, but supportive. And the question, again, from the Pew survey, when they ask, is the United States supportive enough of Israel, or too supportive, you find that compared to all of the other denominations, spare the modern Orthodox, that they are amongst the most supportive. And when you look especially at the question about not supportive enough, they tend to be more hawkish than anyone spare the modern Orthodox. Beyond their pro-Israel views, I think people are unaware to the degree to which they are at present lobbying on behalf of Israel's security. If you take, for instance, organizations like Agudat Yisrael of America, as of today, there are already nascent efforts to lobby the American government on behalf of Israel's security, again, which I think most people are unaware of. A third issue here is that they are wealthier than I believe many people believe. Again, from that New York study, if we divide the Haredim into sections, you see that those Lithuanian or Yeshivish Haredim, over 11% are making more than $250,000 a year. Over 30% are making more than $100,000 a year. These are rates that are higher than the non-Orthodox Jewish world. Now, it's true that there are pockets of poverty, especially amongst certain Hasidic sects. It's true that with many kids, the average household expenditures are going to be large, but there is still capacity here for pro-Israel activism. So what do we propose? First, in terms of mobilizing Jewish background and Jewish affinity demographic sectors, one, think about how to raise the rate of support. I mean, we have high rates of support without any focused investment or effort. Imagine what we could accomplish if we were to try. Second, mobilize these groups for action, and by that I mean think about how to encourage them to take part in rallies, defend Israel in newspapers, become an organized force for lobbying politicians, making politically linked donations. How would we do this? First, I believe in the power of organization. In other words, as individuals, your power is much more limited. We have to think about how to organize these demographics, which is going to be an enormous challenge. It may be something like creating an organization of Americans of Jewish heritage, but something needs to be done in order to organize the demographic sector. Second, think about something like a birthright to Israel. Now, obviously, we can't do an all-expenses-paid trip to potentially millions of additional people, but there's no reason to think that has to be all expense paid. There are ways to do a subsidized trip that would be something less than what birthright is at present. There's also a way to think about who to target, and that is to start again with that 972,000. Take the people who've already donated and say, by the way, is there anyone in your family that you think might be interested in participating in a subsidized trip to Israel? Third, we have to make better use of junior abroad programs, both in terms of targeting these demographics and when they're in this country, to make better use of their time here. In terms of the American Haredim, we have to increase our capacity for pro-Israel activism. And first and foremost, we have to engage existing Haredi institutions. Let me give you an example about what I mean. Briefings, regular briefings by Israeli officials, both here and there in the United States. By the way, this is true for organizations like INSS as well. At present, we are not engaging the ultra-Orthodox as we should, and it's time for us to think as an organization as well about what we can do. Of course, this is a two-way street. We have to encourage organizations like Agudat Yisrael of America to start thinking about how they can also engage better in this. Encourage them to have trips to Israel that aren't just about immersion in religious study, but also thinking about learning something about Israeli security challenges. Second, encourage the formation of a Haredi Political Action Committee, or PAC, that deals more clearly with Israel's security challenges. And third, now there are issues about who can promote a political action committee, but obviously it's not the government of Israel. Third, this is something that the government of Israel can do. Add a Haredi component to the Prime Minister's initiative that I mentioned at the outset. We take for granted that they're going to be part of the Jewish future. However, there is, again, point in investing in this demographic. And the best way to do that is to include a representative from an ultra-Orthodox institution in the United States in the committee. To conclude, the discussion, in our opinion, from an Israeli perspective, or at least a pro-Israel activist perspective, the discussion of American Jewry to date is far too narrow. It focuses solely on shoring up the communal center, and it's time to widen this discussion and start to engage other groups and mobilize them for action. Those non-Jews with a connection to Judaism and the ultra-Orthodox or Haredim. Let me conclude with a thought that these changes in Jewish demographics are going to be a major challenge for Israel in the future. But by addressing this challenge, I think we're going to open up our eyes to groups which have large potential, and until today, to be honest, we have frankly been ignoring. Thank you very much. And it's my pleasure to call up Dr. Oded Aran, who's a senior research fellow at the INSS.